He was only 21. A mother's scream shattered the silence of a Florida night as her son lay bleeding out in his bedroom. The frantic call for 911, the desperate attempt to save him, yet within minutes, James Barry was gone. But the truth of what happened inside that locked home was darker than anyone could imagine. If you look away now, you may never know how close this could come to someone you love. Subscribe before the next case we uncover hits too close to your own home. It was a little after midnight in the quiet town of Loxahatchee, Florida. The kind of place where neighbors lock their doors, where silence is the norm, and where crime feels far away. But in one small home on Glasgow Drive, the silence shattered. At 12:58 a.m., a frantic 911 call came through. On the line, a mother, Nicola Barry, her voice cracking with panic. She was begging for help, screaming that her son was bleeding, that someone had to come quickly. Behind her words, dispatchers could hear chaos, the echo of footsteps, a man's voice shouting. For CPR instructions, the unmistakable cries of a family living through their worst nightmare. When first responders raced down the street, lights flashing across the otherwise still neighborhood, they were greeted by a chilling sight on the front lawn. 3 people stood in the night air, pale, trembling, stained with blood. Nicola Barry, distraught and unable to form full sentences. Her boyfriend, Guy Hand, shaking, but insistent that he had tried everything to save James. And James's best friend, Jeff Jaspikowski, his hands trembling, his clothes marked with blood that wasn't his own. Inside the home, deputies rushed toward the bedroom. And there they found 21-year-old James Barry, collapsed on his bed. His chest bore the unmistakable marks of a violent stabbing. EMTs pulled him onto the floor, desperately pressing down on his wounds, forcing air into his lungs, fighting to keep him tethered to life. But within minutes, the fight was over. The time of death was called. James Barry, only 21 years old, was pronounced dead inside the home where he should have felt safest. As the medics stepped back, officers began to scan the scene, and what they found sent a chill through the entire investigation. In the kitchen, sitting almost neatly on the counter, was a 10-inch carving knife. Its white handle stained red, its curved blade glistening under the harsh light. Not discarded outside, not dropped in a struggle. Left inside the home. And worse, it wasn't a stranger's weapon. It came from that very kitchen drawer. Investigators quickly learned that Guy Hand, Nicola's boyfriend, was a butcher by trade. He admitted he'd used that very knife just hours earlier to carve their roast for dinner. And yet now, that same blade had pierced James's chest again and again until his life was stolen. Deputies moved through the house carefully, noting every trace of blood. A trail led from the kitchen toward the hallway, then into James's bedroom, where it ended at the scene of his death. But one detail gnawed at them immediately. All the doors had been locked, just as Guy claimed they always were before the family went to bed. The front door, locked. The side patio door, locked. Windows, untouched. But the back door, wide open. Had the killer entered through that door? Or had someone inside the home left it open on purpose? Outside, the survivors tried to explain the impossible. Guy insisted he locked every door. Jeff swore that no one else should have been in the house. Nicola was too distraught to process it. None of them could understand how an intruder could appear, commit murder, and vanish, without breaking a single lock. And yet, someone had. Neighbors watched from across the street as the flashing lights painted the night sky. Officers cordoned off the house, the backyard, the open door. On the patio table, just feet from that open door, they spotted something. A cell phone. Pink case. Drops of what appeared to be blood nearby. The mystery deepened. Who did the phone belong to? How had it ended up outside, next to the only unlocked door? And as James's body was carried from the house, covered beneath a white sheet, investigators knew one thing for certain. This was no random break-in. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house had slipped inside that night. Someone who knew exactly where the knives were kept. Someone who had been close enough to James to know where he slept. The evidence raised the darkest question of all. If the house was locked, did the killer ever truly leave? As deputies searched the home, the survivors began piecing together their own theory of what had happened. Still shaken, still covered in James's blood, they whispered the same name again and again. Melanie, 19 years old. James's on-again, off-again girlfriend. To the family, she was no stranger. In fact, she'd once been welcomed in with open arms. Holidays at their table, Hours spent at their home. She knew where the cutlery was kept. She knew the layout of the house better than anyone outside that family. But over time, what began as a sweet high school romance had turned volatile. James's sister would later describe it as a roller coaster, together, broken up, then back again. Each reunion shorter, each fight louder. James wanted out, but Melanie wasn't ready to let go. That night, James had been messaging her. Detectives would later uncover the texts that marked his final hours. He wrote with honesty that cut like a blade, "It might be better for us to split and focus on ourselves. We're not happy." It wasn't the first time he'd tried to end things. But this time, he seemed determined. He even warned her, "Go away, or we're done. This is disrespectful." His best friend, Jeff, recalled how Melanie had shown up earlier that evening, uninvited. James told her to leave. She did. Or so they thought. Hours later, James confided that she'd circled back. She parked outside, wouldn't leave, sent message after message. And then came the most chilling detail of all. Outside the open back door, investigators discovered the pink cell phone. Its case unmistakable. Drops of blood nearby. The phone belonged to Melanie. To the family, there was no doubt. Guy called her a psycho. Jeff shook his head, repeating, "She killed him." Even Nicola, through her grief, realized the argument had escalated far beyond teenage heartbreak. But detectives faced a puzzle. How had Melanie gotten inside a locked house? There was no forced entry, no broken locks, no smashed windows. And yet, the murder weapon had come from inside the home. If it wasn't Melanie, then who? The survivors were adamant. To them, it was clear. James had tried to end things. Melanie refused to accept it. And now, James was dead. James can't speak for himself anymore, but you can make sure his story is never silenced. Subscribe now. And if you choose not to, go to the comments and explain why you'd turn your back on his voice. Just outside the open back door, under the dim glow of the patio light, deputies noticed something small but striking. A cell phone, lying face down on the table. Its pink case smudged, its screen cracked, and next to it, tiny drops of what looked like blood. When they turned it over, the truth confirmed every suspicion. This wasn't just any phone. It belonged to 19-year-old Melanie Eam, James Barry's girlfriend. For investigators, it felt like a breakthrough. The same young woman James's best friend and his mother's boyfriend had immediately named as the killer had apparently left her phone behind at the crime scene. Her device, her blood, mere feet from the only door that wasn't locked. But while the discovery screamed guilt, it also raised unnerving questions. Why would she abandon it? Phones are the one thing people hold tightest, especially in moments of panic. Was this a careless mistake in the chaos of murder? Or was it something far more sinister, a plant, staged to frame her before the police even arrived? Inside the home, the clues became even more complicated. On the kitchen counter, deputies studied the bloodied carving knife. White handle, 10-inch curved blade. It wasn't foreign, it wasn't forced in. This weapon belonged here, and not just anywhere in the home. Investigators traced it back to the second drawer down by the refrigerator, a place Melanie knew well. She had spent countless nights in this house, cooking dinners with James, baking for the family. She knew where every pan, every spoon, every knife was kept. But the knife had another, more disturbing connection. It belonged to Guy Hand, Nicola's live-in boyfriend. Guy was a butcher by trade. He'd used that exact blade just hours earlier to carve a roast for dinner. To the untrained eye, it was just another kitchen tool. But to Guy, it was part of his profession. He owned several blades just like it. Bigger, sharper, deadlier. That detail unsettled detectives. If Melanie had killed James, she had armed herself with a weapon she knew existed, one she'd seen used dozens of times in that kitchen. But if she hadn't, it meant someone else inside the house had taken a knife from the drawer, someone who had handled blades like that for years, someone who knew exactly how to use it. Then came another red flag. Guy admitted he had moved the knife after the attack. He picked it up, carried it from the bedroom into the kitchen, and left it on the counter. His reason? He didn't want anyone to trip over it or get hurt. But crime scenes are fragile. Every second counts, every piece of evidence matters. Investigators knew the golden rule: never touch the murder weapon. Yet here was Guy, by his own admission, tampering with the most crucial evidence. When pressed, his explanation sounded less like common sense, and more like desperation, and the questions kept piling up. Why would a grieving boyfriend's first instinct be to handle the very weapon that had just killed the son of the woman he lived with? Why not leave it untouched for police? Why carry it away with his own bare hands? And why was there a kitchen towel sitting beside the knife, as though someone had wiped it clean before setting it down? Deputies turned back to the trail of blood. It didn't tell a story of a single sudden strike. It painted a narrative of movement. The attack had started in the kitchen, the place where the knife was stored, then carried down the hallway, ending in James's bedroom. Drops of blood marked every step. This wasn't a clean, quick kill. It was a chase, a struggle. James had tried to escape, and yet, no one in the house claimed to have seen the killer. Jeff only heard James's desperate cries, shouting for him to run. Nicola said she woke up to chaos, disoriented by earplugs. Guy insisted he locked all the doors and was asleep until Jeff screamed. So how had someone entered this house without breaking in? If Melanie was the killer, she had either stolen a key or been let in by someone James trusted. But if it wasn't her, then the nightmare was even worse. It meant the killer had been inside the house all along. By the time detectives stepped back, the picture was murky. On one hand, Melanie's phone, her jealousy, her history with James all pointed to her. On the other, the strange actions of Guy Hand, his access to knives, his decision to move the weapon, his inconsistent story, planted doubt. Was this a crime of passion, driven by a young woman who couldn't accept the end of a relationship? Or was it a crime staged to look that way, orchestrated by someone closer to the family, someone who knew just how to twist the narrative? Every piece of evidence seemed to accuse someone different. The phone screamed Melanie. The knife whispered Guy. And the blood trail told only of James's terror in his final moments. For investigators, one truth was clear. The discovery of that phone and that knife had cracked the case wide open. But what lay on the other side wasn't clarity. It was a maze of suspicion, betrayal, and secrets that would take years to untangle. While crime scene investigators marked every drop of blood inside the Barry home, while deputies logged the knife and photographed the patio table, the person everyone suspected was already gone. 19-year-old Melanie Eam didn't wait for detectives to knock. She didn't return to defend herself. She didn't sit with the Barry family in grief. Instead, sometime after midnight, she slipped into her silver Toyota Corolla, started the engine, and disappeared into the night. What followed was a desperate flight across state lines. Nearly 1,000 miles. Florida to Georgia. Georgia to the Carolinas. The Carolinas to Maryland. A road trip fueled not by sightseeing, not by freedom, but by fear. She drove through the darkness, headlights cutting across lonely stretches of highway, taillights fading into the distance at every gas station she passed. There were no calls to the police to claim her innocence. No panicked texts to friends asking for help. Only silence. And silence, investigators knew, speaks volumes. Back in Florida, detectives scrambled. With her phone recovered at the scene, they had no way of contacting her. But there were other tools. Highway traffic cameras, toll booth snapshots, and with each hit on her license plate, the map became clearer. Melanie was running. The more distance she put between herself and Loxahatchee, the louder the questions grew. Who drives for 17 hours after the boy she loved has just been murdered? Who heads north without explanation, without warning, without goodbye, unless the weight of guilt is chasing them? By the time her car rolled into a quiet Maryland suburb, dawn was breaking. She pulled into the driveway of her uncle's home, slipped inside, and tried to vanish into the normalcy of family walls. But the investigation was already right behind her. Law enforcement in Florida had alerted Maryland police. Locate her. Confirm her safety. Secure the vehicle. This wasn't framed as a murder arrest. Not yet. Officially, it was a welfare check. But unofficially, everyone knew what it really was. When officers pulled onto the street, her silver Toyota sat parked in plain view. It wasn't hidden in a garage. It wasn't abandoned miles away. It was right there, outside her uncle's home. To investigators, it was as if she hadn't even tried. Almost as though she was waiting for them. The knock at the door was calm, measured. No weapons raised. No shouting. Just officers asking to speak with a teenage girl at the center of a brutal murder case. When the door opened, Melanie stepped out. Small. Pale. Hands folded nervously. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't even surprised. To the officers on scene, it looked like she had been expecting them all along. And then came the words that would echo through the case. When asked if she was all right, she whispered, "I don't know, I'm just scared." Scared of what? Of the police at her door? Of what she had done? Or of what she was about to reveal? In that moment, she wasn't placed in handcuffs. She wasn't read her rights. She wasn't even officially under arrest. She was just 19, standing outside her uncle's home, speaking quietly to officers who didn't yet know the full truth. But detectives in Florida did. They knew this was the moment to press forward. A girl on the run. A body in the morgue. A family demanding justice. The next step would not be about whether Melanie was safe. It would be about whether she was guilty. This is where most people tune out and never learn the truth. Don't be one of them. Hit subscribe, because ignorance doesn't protect you. And if you refuse, write in the comments why you'd rather stay in the dark. Detective William Oliver had driven nearly 1,000 miles from Florida to Maryland to find her. Not to drag her out in handcuffs, not to shove her into a squad car, but to sit across from her and ask the one question only she could answer: what happened inside that house? Melanie didn't fight. She didn't resist. She agreed to talk. The setting wasn't an interrogation room, wasn't a police station, it was her uncle's kitchen table. Family members sat just feet away, listening as the conversation unfolded. And as Detective Oliver pressed record on his phone, he made it clear. This wasn't an arrest. This was her chance to tell her side. But what she said next stunned even seasoned investigators. With her small hands folded on the table, her voice barely above a whisper, Melanie admitted that she had gone to James Barry's house that night. She admitted she'd slipped inside, opened the second drawer in the kitchen, the drawer she knew so well, and pulled out the 10-inch carving knife, the same knife that hours earlier had carved a family dinner. And then she carried it into his bedroom. Her words were quiet, flat, almost emotionless. She didn't scream. She didn't sob. She didn't even hesitate. She said she stabbed him. And then, she said something that froze the room. "I didn't mean to. I thought he'd be okay." Like she had scraped a knee. Like she had broken a glass. As though stabbing the man she claimed to love was nothing more than a mistake. Detective Oliver pressed her gently. "When you used the knife on him, was your intention just to scare him? You didn't want to kill him, did you?" Her reply, "No, I didn't mean to. I thought he'd be okay." But the facts told a different story. James hadn't been stabbed once. He hadn't been stabbed twice. He'd been stabbed over and over, the blade plunging deep into his chest. These weren't the marks of a warning. They were the marks of rage. And yet, Melanie clung to her version. She told Oliver she had panicked, that she didn't realize how badly he was hurt, that she thought he would survive. She even described how she dropped the knife somewhere in the room before running. Her escape, she claimed, wasn't about guilt. It was fear. Fear of what had just happened. Fear of being blamed. Fear of facing the truth. But her actions told the real story. She didn't stay. She didn't call for help. She didn't cradle James's body or scream for neighbors. She drove. Hours. States. Buying a new phone at a Walmart along the way. Abandoning the blood-stained one outside the house, like a breadcrumb trail. When Detective Oliver asked her how many times she stabbed James, her answer was chilling in its simplicity. "It's not like I was counting, not noticing, not caring." Her confession, recorded in that Maryland kitchen, became the cornerstone of the state's case. A quiet teenage girl, speaking as though plunging a knife into her boyfriend's chest was just an accident, just a moment of passion, just something she thought he'd be okay from. But investigators knew better. They knew James's wounds were fatal. They knew the blood trail showed he tried to escape. And they knew this was no mistake. Because love doesn't leave someone gasping for air on a bedroom floor. Love doesn't drive 17 hours north without a word. And love doesn't sound so calm when admitting to murder. The courtroom was packed. Family members sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching tissues, staring down the young woman who had once been welcomed into their home. On one side, prosecutors prepared to argue that 19-year-old Melanie Eam had stabbed James Barry in a jealous rage. On the other, her defense team plotted something far riskier. They weren't just going to claim innocence. They were going to suggest someone else, someone inside the house, was the real killer. From the opening statements, the prosecution leaned on what they believed was their strongest weapon, Melanie's own words. They replayed the recording from her uncle's kitchen table in Maryland. The jury heard her say it in her own voice. "I didn't mean to. I thought he'd be okay." They reminded the jury of the pink phone left at the back door, the blood trail through the house, and the confession where she admitted pulling the knife from the drawer herself. But then, the defense countered with a move that changed the entire mood of the trial. They pointed to the man sitting only feet away from Nicola Barry, her live-in boyfriend Guy Hand. The defense argued Guy was not just a witness. He was the one who killed James. They reminded the jury of one fact Guy never denied. When police arrived, he admitted he picked up the murder weapon. He didn't leave it on the floor by James's bed. He carried it down the hallway and placed it on the kitchen counter. Why? They demanded. Why would any innocent man touch the weapon that had just been used to stab his girlfriend's son? Why move it? Why leave his prints? They dug deeper. They reminded jurors that Guy had washed one of his hands before police photographed him. He claimed he used a glass of water an officer had handed him. But to the defense, that wasn't convenience. It was concealment. They argued it was evidence being washed away. And then came the CPR. Guy told jurors he'd been trained in life-saving measures over a dozen times. He knew the rules. He knew the body must be placed on a firm, flat surface. Yet when he and Jeff found James collapsed on the floor, they lifted him onto the bed, a soft mattress where chest compressions are nearly useless. The defense attorney locked eyes with the jury and asked, was that the act of a man desperately trying to save James's life? Or the act of a man making sure James had no chance at all? The jury shifted in their seats. Piece by piece, the defense tore at Guy's credibility. His profession, a butcher, a man accustomed to sharp knives and heavy cuts of meat. His behavior, touching the blade, moving it from the room, leaving a towel near it as though it had been wiped. His story, consistent, yes, but convenient. Too convenient. And then they turned back to Melanie. They described her as a terrified teenage girl, caught in the chaos of a murder she didn't commit. They suggested she had been there, yes, but only as a witness. They claimed she had run not because she was guilty, but because she was horrified. Because she had just watched her boyfriend's stepfather drive a knife into his chest. The Barry family shook their heads in disbelief as the defense spun their story. But inside the jury box, doubt began to fester. For days, testimony went back and forth. Prosecutors insisted the confession was irrefutable. The defense reminded them of every strange act Guy had taken that night. It became less a case of whether Melanie was guilty, and more a question of whether the wrong person was on trial. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the weight of James's death hung over them. Hours passed. Voices rose and fell behind the closed door. They asked for transcripts. They asked for clarification. They argued. And then, they returned, with no verdict. It wasn't a matter of guilt versus innocence. It was a fracture in how they saw her intent. 4 jurors were ready to convict her of second-degree murder with a weapon. But 2 believed she was guilty only of manslaughter. Reckless, negligent, but not intentional. The result? A hung jury. A mistrial. For James's family, it was like losing him all over again. They had sat through every photograph, every message, every detail of his final moments. They had heard his girlfriend admit she stabbed him. And yet, justice was postponed. For Melanie, it was a temporary victory. She wasn't convicted. But she wasn't free either. She would remain in custody, awaiting a retrial. And for Guy Hand, the man now branded by the defense as a possible killer, the mistrial cast a permanent shadow. Was he the grieving boyfriend who tried to save James? Or a hidden suspect who slipped through the cracks? The mistrial left one truth behind: no one was satisfied. Not the jury, not the lawyers, not the family, and certainly not James Barry, whose voice had been silenced in that bedroom. The fight for justice was far from over. Imagine a killer walking free because people looked away. If you don't subscribe, you're saying stories like James's don't matter. If you disagree, prove it. Subscribe. If not, say in the comments why justice isn't worth your click. The first trial had collapsed under the weight of doubt. The defense had painted a picture so twisted that 2 jurors refused to convict. But the state of Florida was not finished. In January 2019, a new jury was selected, new evidence laid out, and a second trial began. This time, the prosecution came prepared to cut through the noise. They began where everything had begun in Maryland, with Melanie's own words. Jurors leaned forward as the audio played. A teenager's voice, steady, almost detached. "I didn't mean to. I thought he'd be okay." The prosecutor paused, then turned to the jury. "That's not how accidents sound," he said. "That's how killers sound, when they've run out of excuses." From there, the state marched through the evidence piece by piece. First, the shirt. The long-sleeve top Melanie wore on the night James Barry died was tested by forensic scientists. On the cuff of her right sleeve, James's blood. Not just a speck, not a smear from brushing against someone else's hands. The prosecution argued it was transfer, proof she had been in direct contact with him as he bled out. Then came the car. Investigators had searched her Toyota Corolla after it was found outside her uncle's home in Maryland. On the gear shift, dried droplets of blood. DNA confirmed it was James Barry's. The state asked the obvious question, if she was merely a witness, standing across the room as another man killed James, how did his blood end up inside her car? How did it cling to the very gear she touched as she fled north? The evidence, the state argued, didn't just place her at the scene. It put her hand on the weapon, her body at the center of the struggle, her flight as the final act of guilt. But the defense refused to back down. They resurrected their theory from the first trial, aiming their fire not at the evidence, but at another man, Guy Hand. They reminded jurors that Guy was a butcher by trade, a man with experience handling knives. They reminded them that Guy admitted he had touched the murder weapon, carried it through the house, and set it on the counter. They reminded them that he washed one hand before being photographed, that his CPR was performed incorrectly, that his story seemed too neat, too rehearsed. The defense attorney raised his voice. From the very moment police arrived, Guy Hand said the same words, "She did it. She did it." Is that the truth? Or was it the quickest way to throw suspicion off himself? But this time, the jury had more than speculation. They had the confession. They had the bloody shirt. They had the car. They had the phone left behind. And they had her own words when asked how many times she stabbed James. "It's not like I was counting." The state leaned on that line in closing arguments. Ladies and gentlemen, people don't lose count of accidents. They lose count of rage. They lose count when they drive a knife into someone's chest again and again and again. The defense made one last plea. They pointed to her age, to her lack of criminal history, to the possibility that she was overwhelmed, a child in a storm too big to survive. They asked the jury to consider whether she was a participant or a witness who had been swallowed by tragedy. And then, it was in the jury's hands. For hours, they deliberated.
Set at no bond. State
would ask that the bond remain at none, as well as no contact with the deceased James Barry's family members and the witnesses. There is a no contact order that has been prepared, and the victim's family, deceased victim's family, is present in court.
Thank you. Mr. Benedict.
I'm not seeking bond at this point, Judge.
Okay. Thank you. While you're signing, I'll make my pronouncement. So I'm going to continue to hold Ms. Eam no bond. I'll note your invocation of rights. I'll order no contact with the victim's family. I order no weapons. Anything else I need to do, state?
The no contact order, I also included witnesses' names.
Thank you. They're all included there. No contact means none. You can't text message, email, phone calls, nothing at all, ma'am. Anything else, state?
No.
Defense?
Thank you, Judge.
Okay, thank you very much.
Melanie stood still. No tears. No collapse. No desperate denial. She didn't flinch as the verdict sealed her fate. For James Barry's family,
in terms of taking this one step at a time, 1 inch at a time, whatever it takes, we'll be here from the beginning all the way to the end to make sure that justice is served the way that it should be served. He loved life. He loved people. There wasn't a bad bone in his body. And I know being interviewed before, people would ask me the same question, and I think every parent would say that they had a really great kid, but James really was. He was very, very special.
the sentence had been read. 19-year-old Melanie Eam would spend 50 years in prison for the murder of James Barry.
Is to impose a sentence of 50 years in the Department of Corrections.